Therefore, there is no condemnation in those who are in Christ Jesus, because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit set me free from the law of sin and death. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those he predestined, he also called. And those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified.
So we all have our own unique rhythms of life. Our daily rituals, traditions, whether it be daily or weekly or yearly, every person has their own sort of unique rhythm to life. But Walter Brueggemann, the great Old Testament scholar, he said there is a broader cycle of life, a broader rhythm of life, that maybe it's so broad we don't even see, but we're always in three different states of being. Called it a perpetual cycle. We're always in it. And every time we cross the cycle, we're hopefully becoming a better person with stronger faith, better Christian. He said you see this in the scriptures, especially with the Israelites. The Israelites were constantly in a state of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. Orientation is when life is going great. It's when you're celebrating God's blessings, everything is peachy. You worked really hard to get to a certain point, and you've gotten there, and you're excited. There's a little pond over here. I'm just exploring all of this for the first time. Disorientation is when something happens to you that kind of derails your plans. Maybe it is an illness, maybe it's a death in the family, or a lost job, a dream deferred. Maybe it's none of those, and it's something totally different. But that sets you on a path toward disorientation. Disorientation is the hardest phase. And then reorientation is when God delivers you from disorientation and you learn a new way of being. And then you go back to orientation again. It's not an exact science. The process sometimes overlaps each other, the cycles do, but we're always in one of those three cycles. Disorientation, though, is the one I want to talk to you about today. That's the hardest one. There was a guy named Spencer West. Spencer West is really unique. He, a few years ago, climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. This is the largest standalone mountain in the world. It's also the largest peak in all of Africa. It's a pretty big continent. And Spencer West actually climbed this mountain. The thing that makes this unique is that he had no legs. No legs at all. I don't mean he had no legs at the ankles or the knees. I mean he had no legs. When he was a boy, he had some sort of spinal disorder, and they had to cut his legs off from the waist down. He had nothing. There are very strong, young, able-bodied men and women who tried to climb Mount Kilimanjaro but couldn't do it, whether it was altitude sickness or whatever. But he did it. He did it with no legs. He did it with his hands. It's a really remarkable thing. You should Google it, Spencer West. But at the end, after all these tour guides told him that he couldn't do it, someone asked him, "What did you tell them when you got down after you climbed this mountain?" He said, "I didn't rub it in her face." He just said, "My goal this entire time was to redefine what was possible." Redefine what was possible. Saw another trail over here. We're going to take that. Disorientation is about redefining what is possible. When many of us go into a state of disorientation, we begin to question everything. Maybe we question God. We question if we'll ever get out of this state of disorientation. For the Israelites who had just crossed the Red Sea, they had just left disorientation, and for years they cried out to God, "Please deliver us from slavery." They questioned if God even existed, but they kept crying out. They were questioning everything. Disorientation. Maybe you're in that now. is the hardest phase. So Paul writes this letter to the Romans, and before you understand Romans chapter 8, you have to understand the big elephant in the room, and that was Emperor Nero. Emperor Nero was, he became king of all of Rome, the largest empire on earth at the time, when he was 17 years old. And you hope that a young man who's becoming king would have some moral fiber to him that he can grow into, but that wasn't the case for Nero. He was corrupt from the beginning and got more corrupt as he went along. He was known for his debauchery, his drinking, his womanizing. He was known for having absolutely no mercy at all. If anyone ever disagreed with him, no matter who they were, he would kill them. His own mother was the exception. His mother disagreed with him one time, and instead of killing her, he just banished her from the entire Roman Empire. Not a merciful man. He was also obsessed with winning and being the best at everything. And so he would hold these competitions. He considered himself an athlete and a poet and an artist and a musician. So he'd have these fixed competitions where he would be him versus other people who were poets and athletes and musicians. And well, guess what? He won all of them. They were fixed. He just couldn't stand to lose. He was just a man without any moral fiber. And then a big scandal happened. There was a huge fire in the city of Rome, and 25% of Rome was completely leveled. And more than half of the city of Rome was severely burned or gone entirely. And of course, when it first happened and this fire raged on for weeks, there wasn't like a fire department they could call. And once the fire settled down, he became sort of he took the role as the healer. You know, he provided food and supplies for the people who didn't have a home. He was the guy who was trying to console people. But then the word got out. Listen to this. The word got out that he was the one who started the fire. People found out that while the fire was burning on that first night, he was on the deck playing the fiddle. He was celebrating. Then the word got out that he wanted a great big new palace for himself. And there was nowhere to put it. People were putting two and two together and realized he was the one who started the fire, Billy Joel. He was the one who did it. And there was this great big scandal. And so when he was starting to feel the heat, he did what he would always do, which is persecute the Christians. And so he began rounding up the Christians and saying, the Christians, they were the ones who did it. And so he fed them to the lions, or he used them as human torches, or just found these grotesque ways to kill them and really put all the blame upon them and made them the scapegoat. And so he was known for being really the first emperor to persecute Christians, and he was also the worst one. And so Paul is writing to these group of Christians knowing that there is a bloodthirsty king tyrant who is trying to hunt them down. And instead of calling them out, here's what he says. He says, all things work for the good of those who love God. He drew a distinction. Whereas in Rome, in the kingdom of Rome, all things worked for the good of Nero. See, Nero wanted a palace so bad. By the way, this palace was like a golden dome with 300 rooms. It was so gaudy. It was so gross. He didn't need it. He already had a huge palace. But in order to get this gaudy golden dome palace, he burnt half the city. He killed their Christians. And then he raised the taxes so he could build the palace in the part of Rome that had burned. All things worked to the good of Nero. Paul knew this. So in contrast, Paul said, all things work for the good of those who love God. If you find yourself in a state of disorientation, remember that verse. When you question if things are meaningless, if you question your faith, if you question God, if you question if you'll ever get out of disorientation, remember that God is going to use all of this suffering that you're doing in this disorientation stage, and he's going to use it for good. He's going to make it all make sense one day. He's going to make it all into good. It was December 1st, 1955, and Rosa Parks had a plan. She was not going to sit on the back of the bus that day. And she was telling her friends about this protest she had planned, and they told her not to do it. They said, look, you're going to get horribly beaten. You're going to be famous for all the wrong reasons. You might have someone show up at your house one night ready to harm you. Don't do this. We care about you. But she said, no, I'm definitely going to do this. So the day comes, and of course she protests, she's arrested. And if you ever heard about Rosa Parks, whether it be on TV or in the history books, there's always this iconic photo of her getting booked at the police station. And the police officer in that photo, it's an interesting story. That police officer is a Christian. He's actually a United Methodist. And he said, here's how the story goes. He said, as the call came into the police station that they had arrested someone for protesting on the bus, he could feel the tension in the air. And he knew that she might get harmed. He was afraid that as they would put her fingerprints down, as they were pressing her fingers down, that they would break her fingers out of their disdain for her. And he didn't want that. So he volunteered to be the one to book her. He said in his head he imagined being this gentle, loving guide in the whole process of being booked and then put into jail. Because of her courage and her bravery and her commitment to the cause, she met someone like Christ, someone behaving like Christ at this police station. Years later, this police officer, he grows older, and he's worshiping at the largest United Methodist Church in all of America. It's Fraser UMC, and his pastor, John Ed Matheson, he was referring to this moment for one of his parishioners, that police officer, and he said, do you know why God leads us through deep waters? Because God knows that Satan doesn't know how to swim. Which is another way of saying that evil doesn't have enough patience, enough compassion to sit with us in those moments of disorientation. Evil will not sit with us in those deep waters, in those moments of disorientation. And so we remember that today. And disorientation in those moments that we feel like we're questioning everything and questioning God, that God is still with us and God is going to make good come from this. Disorientation is actually the best phase that we go through. Beautiful things come out of disorientation.